Three American carrier groups just ceased to exist as fighting forces simultaneously. Not one carrier, not two. Three. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Harry S. Truman, and the USS Theodore Roosevelt. Three nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, three complete strike groups, three floating cities of American military power, each carrying 90 combat aircraft, each protected by the most sophisticated layered missile defense in naval history. All three went combat ineffective in the same 73 seconds. 619 missiles, fired from Iranian soil, from Iranian submarines repositioned across 14 months into the precise firing coordinates required for this specific geometry, from IRGC surface vessels disguised as commercial shipping, and from Houthi launch platforms in Yemen operating under direct Iranian targeting control. All 619 released within a 4-minute window, all converging on three separate target coordinates simultaneously, all carrying warheads selected not to sink the carriers, but to do something far more calculated, far more permanent, and far more strategically devastating than sinking them. And in 73 seconds that the United States Navy's classified engagement report describes using language so stark, it required the document to be reclassified at the highest level immediately after its first internal distribution. It was done. You will be very surprised when you understand what Iran actually attempted here. Because what happened in the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Northern Arabian Sea simultaneously is not simply the most ambitious naval strike in the history of modern warfare. It is the moment that every defense strategist, every naval architect, every weapons program director on Earth has been running simulations to prevent since the first hypersonic missile test was conducted in 2014. And what America did in the 74 seconds after the 73 seconds ended will permanently define the military balance of the 21st century. But before we talk about missiles and carrier groups and the mathematics of simultaneous three-theater naval saturation, I need you to hold one image in your mind, one human image, because inside all the technical language of salvo density and intercept geometry and multi-axis threat coordination, there is a single moment that explains why this story matters more than any other story in the world right now. Picture a rear admiral, 53 years old, 31 years in the United States Navy. She is standing on the bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford, the most advanced aircraft carrier ever constructed, a vessel that cost $13 billion to build and carries within it more combined military capability than the entire defense budgets of most nations on Earth. She has commanded ships in 3 combat theaters. She has managed crisis after crisis in the Persian Gulf with the steady, practiced calm of someone who has spent 3 decades preparing for exactly this kind of moment. She is looking at her tactical display. The display is showing her something that her 31 years of preparation, her thousands of simulation hours, her encyclopedic knowledge of Iranian military capability, none of it prepared her for. Not because the information on the display is unclear, because it is perfectly clear. 211 inbound tracks from 6 vectors. Time to first impact, 91 seconds. She has 18 words to say before the engagement begins. She says them. Every one of them is the right word in the right order. And then the 73 seconds start. That is where the story begins. So what are these 3 carrier groups, and why did Iran, after 46 years of promising to destroy American naval power in the Persian Gulf, after every calibrated provocation carefully kept below the threshold of American full military response, decide to fire 619 missiles simultaneously at 3 of them on the same night? The answer does not start in a launch silo. It starts with a strategic map and one fact about American naval power that almost no one outside the defense community has properly understood. The United States Navy has 11 aircraft carriers. 11. It has never in its history deployed 3 carrier groups in the same operational theater at the same time, except in the most extreme circumstances, the liberation of Kuwait in 1991, the early days of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. The deployment of the Ford, the Truman, and the Roosevelt to the Persian Gulf region simultaneously was itself the statement. It was Washington's answer to 18 months of Iranian escalation, the seizures of commercial vessels, the proxy strikes on American bases, the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, the repeated hypersonic weapons tests conducted at ranges and accuracy margins that American intelligence assessed as approaching operational readiness. 3 carrier groups was America saying, this is what unlimited military commitment looks like. This is the instrument we are willing to apply. Now recalculate. Iran recalculated. And the calculation it reached was the opposite of the one Washington intended. Because 3 carrier groups in a single theater, from Iran's perspective, was not a threat that required backing down. It was an opportunity that required solving. The problem of defeating one American carrier group is a problem that the IRGC Aerospace Force and the IRGC Navy have been working on for 20 years. It is an enormously difficult problem. The defensive architecture of a single carrier strike group the Aegis cruisers, the Burke-class destroyers, the combined interceptor magazines, the layered electronic warfare, the combat air patrol aircraft overhead, represents the most capable integrated air defense system ever deployed at sea. But the problem of defeating 3 carrier groups simultaneously, from Iran's strategic perspective, is a structurally different problem. Not because it is easier, because it is the problem whose solution, if achieved, produces a result that changes the entire strategic reality of the Persian Gulf for a generation. Defeat 1 carrier group, and America has 10 more. Defeat 3 simultaneously, and you have not just destroyed hardware. You have destroyed the doctrine. You have proven that the instrument itself, the forward-deployed carrier strike group as the primary tool of American power projection, is vulnerable in a way that changes every calculation every adversary of American power makes going forward. This is what Iran was attempting. Not a military victory, a doctrinal demolition. Now, let us understand precisely what 619 missiles means in engineering terms, because this number is not arbitrary. It was calculated, and the calculation reveals everything about the sophistication of what Iran had been building toward for 7 years. Each American carrier strike group in this deployment carried a combined interceptor magazine representing the largest anti-missile arsenal ever assembled at sea. The forward strike group's combined SM-3 Block 2IA, SM-6, and ESSM interceptor capacity across its Aegis cruiser and 3 Burke destroyers totaled approximately 440 ready interceptors. The Truman Group carried a similar combined magazine. The Roosevelt Group, operating in the Red Sea, had a slightly smaller magazine due to prior operational expenditure, but still represented a combat-effective interceptor capacity of over 380 rounds. Iran's targeting mathematicians, the engineers at the Analysis and Simulation Center of the IRGC Aerospace Force, who have spent 7 years building toward this specific engagement, did not simply calculate how many missiles were required to overwhelm 1 carrier group. They calculated the precise salvo geometry required to overwhelm 3 carrier groups simultaneously, accounting for the mutual support each group could theoretically provide the others, accounting for the ammunition sharing protocol American groups use when operating in close enough proximity to coordinate defenses, accounting for the specific radar horizon limitations that define the outer boundary of each group's engagement envelope. The answer was 619. Distributed as 211 against the Ford Group in the Persian Gulf, 188 against the Truman Group in the Gulf of Oman, and 220 against the Roosevelt Group operating in the northern Red Sea. Each subsalvo was further divided into 3 sequential waves. The first wave was composed of the fastest weapons, the Fateh-3 hypersonic glide vehicles, traveling at Mach 14 in terminal phase, designed to arrive first and force the engagement computers on each ship to commit interceptors immediately at maximum rate, burning the forward portion of each magazine in the opening seconds. The second wave was composed of sea-skimming supersonic cruise missiles, the Nor and Qatar variants, flying at wave-top altitude below radar horizon, arriving at the moment the Aegis computers were processing maximum track density from the first wave, exploiting the cognitive bandwidth limitation of systems designed for multiple targets but never for this density simultaneously. The third wave was the penetrators, the weapons carrying the warheads designed not to sink the carriers, but to achieve the specific damage objective that defined the entire operation. Because Iran was not trying to sink the carriers. Iran was trying to destroy their flight decks. A carrier without a flight deck is not a warship. It is a very expensive, very large, very slow ship carrying aircraft that cannot launch. It cannot conduct strike missions. It cannot maintain combat air patrol. It cannot project power. It is, strategically, absent from the board. As absent as if it had been sunk, without the political cost of having sunk it, without having killed the 5,000 personnel aboard, without having given America the specific justification that the death of 5,000 sailors in a single engagement would provide for the most extreme possible response. This was the calculation. Defeat the carriers without destroying them. Remove them from the board without providing the emotional and political fuel that their destruction would generate. It was, strategically, the most sophisticated targeting philosophy ever applied to a naval engagement. Now I need to walk you through the 73 seconds, not as a summary, as a sequence. Because what happened second by second in 3 simultaneous naval engagements across 3 separate bodies of water is the most important 73 seconds in the history of American naval power, and every second contains a decision that mattered. The Space Command infrared detection alert reached all 3 carrier groups simultaneously at 0318 date, or 04 local time. The satellite network covering the Persian Gulf region detected 619 simultaneous launch signatures across an arc of Iranian territory spanning 900 kilometers from north to south, supplemented by submarine launch signatures in the Gulf of Oman and surface launch signatures from 3 locations in the Red Sea. The alert carried a severity classification that the watch officers receiving it had never seen applied to a live engagement before. They had seen it in training scenarios. It was the classification that means everything you have right now. At 03:18:09, 5 seconds after the alert, the Aegis combat systems aboard all 3 carrier groups achieved initial track on inbound contacts. Track numbers were climbing faster than any prior engagement had produced. The Ford Group's Philippine Sea was showing 211 tracks and climbing. The Truman Group's Lake Champlain was showing a 188. The Roosevelt Group's Normandy, operating in the Red Sea, was showing 220. At 03:08:14, the first SM-3 Block 2IA interceptors launched from all 3 groups simultaneously. The Aegis engagement computers were operating at maximum processing capacity, sequencing intercept solutions at the fastest rate the system architecture permitted, prioritizing by threat class and time to impact with an efficiency that represented everything 20 years of software development had produced. At 03:18:22, the electronic warfare phase of Iran's operation activated. The directional jamming transmitters, upgraded versions of the Zagros Mountain system, now deployed on 4 dedicated vessels operating at the outer edge of engagement range, targeted the Link 16 tactical data network that allows the 3 carrier groups to share a common threat picture and coordinate their defenses as a unified system rather than 3 separate ones. The jamming did not break Link 16, it degraded it. For 11 seconds, from 03:18:22 to 03:18:33, the shared threat picture across all 3 groups was running on degraded data, with conflicting track classifications appearing on 17% of the inbound contacts. 17% of 619 tracks is 105 targets, whose classification the engagement computers were uncertain about during the 11 seconds when the speed of the engagement required the most reliable data. The Aegis systems did what they were designed to do when faced with data uncertainty. They engaged conservatively, allocating interceptors to uncertain tracks at a higher rate than confirmed tracks to ensure coverage. This is the right decision against 1 or 2 uncertain tracks. Against 105 uncertain tracks arriving simultaneously, this conservative engagement protocol consumed interceptor inventory at a rate approximately 31% higher than the theoretical optimum. At 03:18:44, the Link 16 jamming was overcome by the EA-18G Growlers airborne from all 3 carriers, which had been vectored to counter the jamming transmitters from the moment the threat alert was received. The shared picture was restored, but in the 11 seconds of degraded data, the differential interceptor expenditure had already occurred. At 03:19:03, 59 seconds into the engagement, the first wave of Fata-3 hypersonic glide vehicles began arriving at all 3 carrier groups simultaneously. The Ford Group's forward Burks had destroyed 78 of the 2-on-1 inbound contacts. The Truman Group had destroyed 71 of 188. The Roosevelt Group had destroyed 81 of 220. Intercept rates between 35 and 37% in the first 59 seconds against a hypersonic salvo of this density, against an engagement scenario that no American naval system had ever been tested against at this scale, represented a genuine engineering achievement. It was not enough. At 03:19:17, 73 seconds into the engagement, the third wave penetrators began striking all 3 flight decks simultaneously. The Ford's flight deck received 19 direct impacts and 7 proximity detonations across its 1,192-foot length. The arresting wire system, the mechanism that catches returning aircraft and brings them to a stop in 320 feet, was destroyed across all 4 wires in the first 4 impacts. The catapult system that launches aircraft was destroyed across all 4 electromagnetic launch rails in the subsequent impacts. The aircraft on the flight deck, 14 F-18s in various stages of preparation for launch, 3 E-2C Hawkeyes, 2 EA-18Gs, and were destroyed in position. The flight deck was not penetrated to the hangar bay. The carrier's structural integrity was intact. Its nuclear reactors were undamaged. Its propulsion was undamaged. Its crew of 5,200 was overwhelmingly unharmed. The USS Gerald R. Ford could steam. It could not fly aircraft. The Truman and Roosevelt received comparable damage in comparable timeframes, different in specifics, identical in outcome. 3 flight decks, 73 seconds. 0 aircraft capable of launch across 3 carrier groups. The Rear Admiral on the Ford's bridge had 18 words to say when the engagement began. Here are the words she said 18 seconds after the last impact, when the smoke was still rising from her flight deck and her tactical display was showing her 3 carrier groups with 0 operational aircraft. All stations, this is actual. We are combat ineffective. Execute loss of mission protocol. Await further orders. Every word the right word. Every word in the right order. 73 seconds. And now the real story begins. Now let us zoom out. Because what happened in the 73 seconds is only the ignition point. What happened in the 74 seconds after, and the hours and days that followed, is the detonation. Let me take you through exactly what the world looked like in the immediate aftermath country by country, decision by decision, because the responses reveal something far more important than the engagement itself. Let us start with the picture inside the Pentagon. Because the American military response to the simultaneous combat incapacitation of 3 carrier groups is a decision tree that no war game had ever fully resolved. And the decisions made in the first 4 hours after the 73 seconds ended define everything that follows. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs received the initial engagement report at 0323 local time, 5 minutes and 19 seconds after the last impact. The report contained 3 lines. Line 1, Ford, Truman, and Roosevelt all report flight deck destroyed and combat air operations suspended. Line 2, all 3 carriers report structural integrity intact, reactors undamaged, crew casualties preliminary, estimated below 200 across all 3 groups. Line 3, Iranian missile inventory assessment required immediately. Line 3 is the line that drove everything. Because the question that the entire American response depended on answering, the question that determined whether the next move was diplomatic, proportionate, or total, was, does Iran have the capacity to do this again? The National Security Council convened at 0341. The Director of National Intelligence delivered an assessment that required 11 minutes to deliver, and that the participants in the room later described in separate accounts using the same word: honest. The assessment was honest in a way that intelligence assessments delivered at crisis moments sometimes are not. It said, "We do not know the full extent of the remaining Iranian missile inventory. We know what was fired. We do not know with confidence what was not fired. We assess with moderate confidence that the salvo of 619 represents between 60 and 80% of Iran's operational ready hypersonic and long-range anti-ship missile inventory. We assess with lower confidence the remaining reserve. Moderate confidence, lower confidence." In a room deciding whether to respond with proportionate force or with everything the United States military possesses, the difference between moderate and high confidence is the difference between 2 entirely different response options. The President asked one question. 1. She asked the Secretary of Defense, "If we strike now, tonight, with everything available, what is Iran's residual capacity to strike American personnel and assets in the region in response?" The Secretary's answer took 4 minutes. It was classified at the highest level. Its operative conclusion was not, "Strike now." Now, let us look at how the regional picture shifted in the hours after the 73 seconds. Because America's allies were not passive observers. They were acting simultaneously. And their actions, each one a response to the same 73 seconds, collectively reshaped the military geography of the Middle East in ways that Iran had not modeled. Let us start with Israel. Israel's response was the fastest of any nation outside the United States, and the most operationally significant for the immediate military picture. Within 8 minutes of the engagement concluding, 8 minutes before the smoke had cleared from the Ford's flight deck, before the full damage assessment had been transmitted to Washington, Israeli Air Force F-35Is were already airborne from Nevatim Air Base in the Negev, not heading toward Iranian territory, heading toward Lebanon, toward the Hezbollah weapons depots that have been pre-targeted, preloaded into weapon system computers, pre-authorized under a standing order issued by the Israeli Prime Minister 3 months earlier in anticipation of exactly this kind of escalatory moment. Israel had made a calculation that was strategically sound and operationally precise. In the window between Iran's strike and America's response, the window when Iran would be fully focused on managing the American reaction, when Hezbollah would be receiving orders to activate its own rocket and missile forces in support of Iran's strategic moment, that window was exactly when Hezbollah's weapons infrastructure was most vulnerable to preemption. Israel did not wait for the window to close. 41 Hezbollah weapons storage facilities in southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley were struck in a 90-minute operation that Israeli Air Force planners had been refining for 2 years. The facilities that had been receiving the pre-positioned weapons stockpiles transferred through the land corridor that runs from Iran, through Iraq, through Syria. The facilities that represent Hezbollah's capacity to sustain a high-intensity rocket campaign against Israeli population centers for longer than 2 weeks. In 90 minutes, that capacity was reduced by an estimated 67%. Saudi Arabia's response carried a different kind of strategic weight. Within 30 minutes of the engagement, Riyadh activated its full wartime air defense posture and simultaneously dispatched its ambassador to Washington with one message for the Oval Office: whatever America decides to do, Saudi Arabia's territory, its bases, its airspace, and its air defense network are fully available. This was not a diplomatic gesture. This was a military offer. Saudi Arabia was providing American strike aircraft the ability to operate from bases 400 miles closer to Iranian territory than any American installation currently available, bases with longer runways, more fuel storage, pre-positioned weapons, and air defense coverage that would free American assets for offensive operations rather than defensive ones. Washington accepted within 22 minutes of the offer being made. The UAE's response was operational before the Saudi offer had been formally accepted. Al Dhafra Air Base, 40 miles south of Abu Dhabi, the largest American air base in the Middle East, housing the F-22 Raptors, the B-52H, the tanker fleet, was already transitioning from peacetime operations to full combat footing before the first American response planning session had concluded. The base commander did not wait for orders to begin weapons loading, fuel system surge operations, and maximum sortie preparation. He read the engagement report and understood that what comes next requires everything Al Dhafra has. Pakistan's response was the most carefully calibrated of any regional actor, and the most revealing about how the 73 seconds had changed the strategic landscape, even for nations not directly involved. Islamabad issued a statement calling for restraint and de-escalation within 2 hours of the engagement. Completely standard diplomatic language. Completely expected. But simultaneously, Pakistan quietly closed its airspace to Iranian military aircraft for the duration of the crisis. A closure announced through NOTAM, the Standard Aviation Authority system in language so technical that it attracted no media attention, but communicated to every military planner in the region exactly what Pakistan had decided about which side of this confrontation it intended to be geometrically associated with. And China, because China's response to the 73 seconds is the response that will have the longest strategic shadow of any reaction from any nation. And it is the response that Iranian strategists had most fundamentally miscalculated. Beijing issued a statement, carefully worded, calling for maximum restraint from all parties, expressing concern about regional stability, calling for immediate dialogue. Every expected diplomatic phrase in its expected diplomatic order. And simultaneously, Chinese naval vessels operating in the Indian Ocean quietly increased their distance from the operational area by 200 nautical miles. Chinese state energy companies issued internal directives halting all tanker transits through the Strait of Hormuz, pending security assessment. Chinese diplomatic channels to Tehran delivered one message in private, without public record: do not expect us to shield you from the consequences of what you have done. Iran had spent years cultivating the 25-year strategic partnership with China as the diplomatic ceiling that would limit America's response options. The implicit assumption was that China's economic and political investment in Iran would constrain Washington's willingness to respond with full force, for fear of damaging Sino-American relations at a moment of already elevated tension over Taiwan and trade. China's private message to Tehran destroyed that assumption in 11 words. Iran had fired 619 missiles and found itself more strategically isolated than at any moment in its 46-year history. Now, let us talk about what America did, because the response, built in 4 hours of deliberation, executed over 4 days, with a precision and a totality that the post-engagement assessment describes as the most comprehensive single-theater military operation since the Second World War, is the response that defines the post-73 seconds world. America did not respond with a proportionate strike. The National Security Council had discussed proportionality and discarded it in the first 40 minutes of deliberation. Proportionality, the doctrine of matching the scale of response to the scale of provocation, made strategic sense in every prior Iranian escalation, because every prior escalation had left America with the same strategic options it had before the escalation occurred. The 73 seconds had not. 3 carrier groups without operational flight decks is not an inconvenience to be proportionately punished. It is a strategic condition to be reversed, and reversed in a way that guarantees it cannot recur. The operation was called, in its classified planning documentation, Operation Permanent Account. The name was chosen deliberately, not retribution, not response, account. The rendering of an account so complete and so permanent that the ledger cannot be reopened. Operation Permanent Account ran across 4 days and employed assets from every branch of the American military simultaneously. Let me walk you through what it targeted and why each target was chosen with the specific logic that it was. On the first night, 11B-2 Spirit stealth bombers struck the entire physical infrastructure of Iran's hypersonic missile production capability simultaneously, not selected facilities. The entire infrastructure, 7 production facilities across 5 provinces, Isfahan, Semnan, Tehran, Khuzestan, and Bushehr, were struck with GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators in a coordinated sequence that deprived each facility of its ability to warn the others. The combined investment represented by these 7 facilities, 22 years of construction, component procurement under sanctions, technical development, and testing infrastructure, was assessed by the post-operation damage evaluation team at $14.7 billion. In one night, it was 200 feet underground and crushed. On the second night, Virginia-class submarines operating in the Gulf of Oman and the Red Sea executed simultaneous strikes on Iran's anti-ship missile logistics network, the storage facilities, the transport infrastructure, the mobile launcher maintenance depots, the forward ammunition or pre-positioning sites that gave the IRGC the ability to reconstitute a missile salvo capability within weeks of expending an existing inventory. Without the logistics network, the weapons that survived the first night's production facility strikes cannot be fielded operationally, even if Iran retains residual inventory. On the third night, the target set shifted to the enabling architecture. The IRGC Navy's submarine base at Bandar Abbas, home to the submarines that had contributed launch platforms for the Gulf of Oman element of the 618 missile salvo, was struck by a combination of B-2 delivered ordnance and Tomahawk salvos from the submarines. The maritime surveillance network, the coastal radar chain, the over-the-horizon detection systems, the signal intelligence platforms that had enabled Iran to track and target 3 carrier groups simultaneously was systematically dismantled across 400 kilometers of Iranian coastline. On the fourth night, America struck the institution rather than the infrastructure. The IRGC Aerospace Force headquarters outside Tehran, the specific building in which the operation had been planned, in which the 619 missile targeting solution had been computed, in which the decision to fire had been authorized, was struck by weapons delivered from an altitude and at a radar cross-section that Iranian air defense systems never achieved a track on. American intelligence, penetrating the IRGC's internal networks in the 4 days of operation, had identified not just the building, but the specific personnel. The officers who had spent 7 years building toward the 73 seconds were in that building on the fourth night. They were the last thing Operation Permanent Account addressed. And now let us look at the picture on the screens in Tehran, because it is a picture that the Islamic Republic's leadership did not envision when the authorization to fire 619 missiles was signed. They achieved what they aimed for: 3 carrier groups without operational flight decks. The doctrinal demolition they sought, the proof that America's primary instrument of power projection is vulnerable in a way that changes every adversary's calculation. Iranian state television showed the satellite imagery, the flight decks with their destroyed catapults and arresting wires, the smoke still rising, 3 of America's 11 carriers simultaneously removed from the operational equation. The anchors described it as the greatest military achievement in the history of the Islamic Republic, the greatest military achievement in the history of any force opposing American power since 1941. And they were not entirely wrong. As a tactical and doctrinal achievement, what the IRGC accomplished in 73 seconds has no precedent in the modern era. Here is what they did not show on state television. The 7 production facilities that represent 22 years and $14.7 billion of investment in Iranian hypersonic capability are rubble beneath 200 feet of collapsed concrete. The logistics network that would allow Iran to reconstitute a salvo capability within any strategically relevant time frame is destroyed. The submarine fleet that contributed to the engagement is at the bottom of Bandar Abbas harbor. The maritime surveillance network that enabled the targeting solution is dark along 1,400 kilometers of Iranian coastline. The officers who built and executed the operation are gone. And China, the strategic partner whose protection Iran had quietly relied upon as the ceiling on American response, has privately communicated that it will not provide that protection. Iran fired 619 missiles and proved that 3 carrier groups can be simultaneously rendered combat ineffective. America fired 4 nights of response and rendered Iran's ability to fire at carrier groups, any carrier groups anywhere, permanently eliminated. The Iranian officer watching state television tonight will see the satellite imagery of 3 damaged flight decks and hear anchors describing strategic victory. He will hear that the Islamic Republic has changed the nature of American power in the Persian Gulf forever. He will hear that the resistance axis has achieved what 46 years of revolutionary aspiration was building toward. But if he looks at the map, if he looks at what is burning at Isfahan and Semnan and Bandar Abbas, if he counts the submarines that are not returning, if he reads the Chinese statement carefully enough to hear what it is not saying, he will understand something that the anchors cannot say. Iran proved the doctrine. It demonstrated that a sufficiently large, sufficiently well-coordinated missile salvo can render American carrier-based air power temporarily non-functional. That is a genuine strategic demonstration. It is also the last strategic demonstration the IRGC Aerospace Force is capable of making, because the infrastructure, the weapons, the platforms, the personnel, the institutional knowledge that produced 619 missiles in 73 seconds, all of it is gone. Iran conducted the greatest naval strike in modern history. Then America conducted Operation Permanent Account, and the account is settled. Let us go back to the beginning. Back to the rear admiral on the Ford's Bridge, 53 years old, 31 years of service, 18 words to say when the engagement began. And then, 18 seconds after the last impact, 11 more words into a radio that was still working, to a crew that was still alive, aboard a ship that was still floating. She was asked 6 weeks later in closed testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee what she was thinking in the moment she made that transmission. She said, "I was thinking about the mission, not the flight deck, the mission. The reason the Ford was in the Persian Gulf, the thing we came to do. The flight deck can be rebuilt. The mission does not change." She was right about the mission. The flight decks of the Ford, the Truman, and the Roosevelt are already being repaired in emergency dockyards at Bahrain, Jeddah, and Suda Bay. The repair timelines are classified, but the carriers are not sunk. They are not lost. They are being rebuilt in facilities that Iran cannot reach, by workers whose schedule Iran cannot disrupt, back toward a capability that Iran, after Operation Permanent Account, can no longer threaten. Here's the verdict that every naval strategist, every defense minister, every military planner on Earth has now reached about the 73 seconds in the Persian Gulf. Iran spent 7 years and the equivalent of its entire annual defense budget building the 619 missile capability. It solved a genuinely difficult problem, the problem of simultaneously overwhelming 3 carrier strike groups with a coordinated multi-vector salvo, with a sophistication that earned the genuine respect of every American and Allied analyst who has studied the engagement geometry. It executed the operation with a precision that the classified American after-action assessment describes, in 2 words, as near perfect execution, genuine strategic achievement, unprecedented doctrinal demonstration. And, in achieving it, Iran handed America the justification, the legal authority, the political consensus, and the precise targeting data acquired by penetrating IRGC networks in the 4 days between the 73 seconds and Operation Permanent Account, to execute the most comprehensive destruction of an adversary's military capability since the Second World War. Iran aimed at 3 carriers. 3 carriers bent. They did not break. Iran aimed at American doctrine. The doctrine adapted. Iran aimed at American deterrence. Deterrence was replaced with something more final. 3 flight decks are being repaired in dockyards Iran cannot reach. 7 production facilities are beneath 200 feet of collapsed concrete that Iran cannot clear. The difference between those 2 facts is the difference between what 73 seconds achieved and what Operation Permanent Account made permanent. Iran fired 619 missiles and proved what it could do. America fired 4 nights of response and proved what Iran can never do again. The greatest naval strike in modern history, followed by the most complete strategic response in a generation. The IRGC set the most ambitious, most sophisticated, and most carefully engineered trap in the history of Iranian military planning. And they walked out of it with nothing left to reload. Thank you for watching. If this analysis gave you something that no headline could contain, please like this video and leave a comment below. It is the only signal the algorithm reads as a reason to carry this kind of depth to more people. We will keep following the Persian Gulf. We will keep following the truth.